So I'm Keela Richards. It's really nice to be in space with all of you today. She, her works for me. I'm the Director of Community Impact of the Minnesota Justice Research Center. And I spend a lot of time thinking about young people, often young people who are stuck in our youth legal systems. And so when I talk about young people, I often try to move away from just sitting in my brain space and really think about what it means to have a body and therefore have embodied experiences, right? It can be easy, I think, for some of us to think about this work really theoretically, and we have to remember that for lots of communities and young people, it's not theoretical, it's real. And so I'm grateful to be in space with all of you today, and I just want to invite everybody to give a special shout out to the young people that are in the room today. We are so grateful you are here. Welcome. I always feel a little bit more grounded when there are young people in the room, so I appreciate you. So today we've got a group of folks here sitting up with me. Local youth legal system advocates and policymakers and educators, some of which I think about as mentors, peers, and even friends. So I'm really honored to be moderating today. So today we've got Mary Moriarty, who's an elected official, elected the Hennepin County Attorney, was elected in 2022, and previously served as the Hennepin County Chief Public Defender for 6 years. As the county attorney, Moriarty serves as the chief executive of Minnesota's largest public law office. Are we getting some reverb? Oh, Douglas. At least it wasn't me. Next to Mary, we've got Dr. Katie Remington Cunningham, who's a community-based researcher whose work has spanned the areas of criminal legal system, youth development, and education. As the research director for the Minnesota Justice Research Center, she leads our organization's efforts to engage in participatory and collaborative community-led research. As a research, she asserts a wildly energetic investment in community and a focus on rigorous scholarship, with really an unyielding commitment to equity, inclusion, and justice. She holds a PhD in education with a focus on developmental psych. On the other side of Dr. Remington Cunningham is Representative Sandra Feist, who is a state representative for District 39B and served in the state legislature since 2021. Representative Feist is a mom, an immigrant lawyer, and an advocate for civil rights. She is the vice chair of the Public Safety, Finance, and Policy Committee, and sits on the Economic Development, Finance, and Policy, Education Policy, and Judiciary Finance and Civil Law Committee. Say that 3 times fast. And then lastly, but certainly not least, Mr. Curtis Shanklin is an associate professor at Metro State University for the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice. In addition, Curtis is also the co-director of the Minnesota Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative, or JDAI, as lots of us in the room might be familiar with. Prior to his role, Curtis served as Deputy Commissioner of the Reintegration and Restorative Services Division at the Minnesota Department of Corrections. He's also nationally accredited as a PREA auditor for the U.S. Department of Justice. Welcome our panelists. So my hope for today's conversation is that it really does feel like a conversation. I'm really grateful that we get to be up here in space with all of you, but I also know, as I know the folks on the panel know, that we are not the only advocates and subject matter experts in the room. So I really would welcome folks to step up and stand out, and please feel free to engage and ask questions. We really do want this to feel like a dialogue. Today we're going to be talking about what our local youth legal system looks like and have a conversation about maybe what we heard earlier, what resonates, and start to think about possibility. And so to get us started, I'd like to invite Mary to just talk a little bit about what you see the values of our current youth legal system being, and where you might see contradiction between values and practice.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. When I became county attorney, and even now, I'm not an expert in this area, and I was really fortunate to be able to approach Sarah Davis, who has taught me a lot about this area. Knowing that the United States Supreme Court talked about how youth were different over a decade ago, and then seeing how the system actually works has been really eye-opening. Part of the surprise maybe is that Minnesota is so far behind because we always consider ourselves to be ahead, right? But we're not. We're way, way behind. And I'm going to give you an example of that. When I was chief public defender, I approached my predecessor in the county attorney's office and I said, this is just a couple of years ago, can we sit down and talk about adolescent brain development in the ages of 18 to 24? And his response was, I believe in adolescent brain development until 18 and then not so much. It was sort of dumbfounding. It was kind of like, is this like climate drama? I don't even know what to do with this. And I think that that's a reflection on the fact that the whole concept of adolescent brain development, I think people accept here in minor kind of stuff that kids do, but certainly not, and people would support diversion for what they would consider minor stuff. But when you're talking about more serious crimes, that is not the case at all. And I could go on, but the lack of, I think, political will to actually provide kids with what they need is pretty appalling and shocking. And I read reports from young people, like certification studies, and every single one of them has this history of a young person who was failed by the system. And it is always framed as the young person failed, this, that, and the other thing. And I always think, had there been effective intervention back here, this young person wouldn't be here. So I will just summarize it in saying it has been an uphill battle to try to actually implement the values that I would guess we all hold here. It's been a huge surprise in some ways what an uphill battle is. And I'm just going to call this out right away. I think if we were talking about a lot of white kids from wealthy families, I think this would be very different. Because I don't hear the word super predator a lot, but that's still the narrative.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Curtis, there's other microphones down there. I'm curious about what that brings up for other folks on the panel. But I heard you name this sort of incongruence between what we name our values and what are important to us, and then what behavior looks like, particularly when we think about difference among young people, and that difference being along identity, right? Like race. Don't be shy. Current values in the youth legal system and contradictions between values and practice. What do you see?
I can respond to that. I think a lot of what you said resonates with me, and sort of the expertise or background that I'm bringing to this conversation is a little bit. One of the values that I think is missing the most from our system, this idea and true belief in real growth and possibility for young people. And I think that those ideas then are hardened by our biases and our discriminatory practices as we think about difference for young people. So that's what's just jumping out for me in response to you.
Thanks, Katie. I promise I won't paraphrase everything you say. But what came up for me again was this idea of incongruence, right? That when we think about what our assumptions are about young people, you know, do we actually believe that every child is capable of self-actualization? Demonstratively, we could argue absolutely not, right? And so what does that mean for us? And what does it mean about our responsibility to young people in terms of holding that possibility?
Good to see everyone. I think that first and foremost, I think we can just look no further than what the data tells us about who we are currently still incarcerating at a more significant rate than other youth, right? So, I mean, here in Minnesota, if you look around the country, as much as we talk about equity, or even if we misconstrue that with equality, right? And we talk about those who are, you know, there's our county attorneys and how they are, you know, administrators of justice, right? But what are the outcomes that come from that? And here in Minnesota, we still have some of the highest disparities here in Minnesota than we do in the nation, right? So when you talk about our African American Black youth, you know, we're somewhere fighting within the top 1, 2, 3 in the nation for desperate or disproportionate treatment of those youth. And when we talk about our indigenous Native American youth, right, we're still fighting in the top 5, you know, within the nation, right? And so when we talk about the ways in which that we all fundamentally go about our jobs and the outcomes in which we seek, we're still not producing those outcomes that we go out and we talk about, even though we have all the research, all the data and everything tells us the ways in which that we should be doing things. And you saw a lot of clear examples of that from the previous panel, right? When you think about our youth who end up in secure detention, right? Many of you have never been to a secure detention place here in Minnesota. I encourage you to go to some of our youth detention facilities because they are not day camps, right? They mirror, the irony is the facilities themselves mirror our adult facilities, when in fact they should be more resembling or reflecting the environment which our youth are going back into. And it's the same thing with our youth to out-of-home placements, right? None of these reflect the realities in which they are going back into. And I think one of the fundamental contradictions and one of the things that we do wrong is, and I think this was talked about a little bit, is focusing primarily on the youth and not encompassing the family within that spectrum as well, right? Because that is the reality that our youth are going back into. You can send a youth to an out-of-home placement, you can spend as much money as you would like, but when that youth comes home, they're going back into their reality, right? So what are we doing to both prepare them to go back into that reality, but also prepare the family to accept them back into that reality? You know, I'm one of those, and I'm sure many of you will, you know, hopefully agree with this, that, you know, no youth just wakes up one day and says, I want to become a menace to society, right? Many of them are a reflection of the product, like many of us, of their environment, right? Where it's not necessarily about success, it's about survival, right? And so what are we doing as both policymakers, as both juvenile justice stakeholders, to ensure that when we are looking at outcomes in which we seek, that we are actually providing the principles and things in place that are going to garner those outcomes. So many times we shy away from what we know is the right thing to do for a number of reasons, right? It can be around messaging, it can be around our own ambitions, right? It can be the politics of the matter. It can be a nervousness about what is this going to look like. And so many of us become guilty of the same things that we've seen in the past. You know, we're still relying upon detention for our youth, even though after decades we have seen that that does not produce the outcomes, right? And so at some point in time, we have to not only look at the data and the research, but we really have to start as I've said this a million times before, think about those youth as if they were your own youth, right? So many times we see, particularly young Black, Native American, Latinx youth, that it's those kids, right? It's those kids over north who are having the problem. It's those kids, over in Frogtown and certain places in St. Paul that are having those problems. Those kids on the reservations, my kids, it's not my kids, right? And we continue to think about it's those kids, right? And you continue to approach your job and your profession in that manner. And if you thought about it more so, if that was my youth who came into contact with the system, what would I want their experience to look like, right? And if you saw a reflection in those youth as you do within your own child, then I think it would change maybe the ways in which we go about both the way we implement and look at policy and legislation and things, but also it would probably help us to approach those situations with a lot more compassion, with a lot more empathy, right? And so I think about that a lot whenever I show up to certain spaces and we talk about the contradictions, because we can talk about all the accomplishments we've had, and we've had many, but we're not moving the needle, even if it is to say just one youth, then we really aren't doing too much at all.
Thanks, Curtis. I think Mary wanted to follow up once.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up with something that you said, Curtis, when you were talking about county attorneys. Before I became county attorney, I had some sense of the systems that were behind or resisting change, but after becoming one, there's an organization called the Minnesota County Attorneys Association. It is membership of all 87 county attorneys, of which I am one. They have been behind resistance of practically every legislative reform, every single one. The pushback I have received from county attorneys across the state about some of the decisions and the things that we are doing is huge. There's also Minnesota Police Association that also exercise tremendous amounts of pressure. And I'm saying we could talk about this if you wanted to too. But these are the systems that we're all up against, especially because county attorneys have all kinds of discretion. We decide a lot, right? We decide if we're going to charge, what we're going to charge, what we're going to offer. That discretion is all ours, and when you know that I would say a majority of the county attorneys in this state are opposed to a lot of the reforms, and the organization that represents them goes to the legislature and opposes all of these reforms, that's just something really important to think about in terms of the culture changing.
I can talk a bit about politics. So yeah, it is interesting to think about what the data shows and how other countries approach youth justice and the conversations that we have at the Capitol. And one thing that I was thinking about as I was listening earlier was that at the Capitol there's a lot of emphasis on victims. And victims are it's a binary. There's a victim, there's an offender, and no offenders are ever victims. Victims are one of my Republican colleagues called some women who came and testified about their experience, who were very brave to speak up, but he called them heroes. And it just struck me that there is this sort of fetishization of this innocent victim, and that we always need to center that when we're looking at any criminal legal reforms. And the conversation that we've had today so far is really focused on the child. It's focused on, I think it was the German system. Is there a public interest in prosecution? And that there's no concept of retribution at all. And I know one of my Republican colleagues one day, when we were talking about this in the Public Safety Committee, this abstract conversation we were having about what is the point of this all. And he said the point is retribution, there is no other point. And it's just what about public safety? It's not that at all. Apparently not. But it is frustrating that we aren't centering children in our conversation about our juvenile justice laws and systems. I did have a little bit of hope, just the other day, like within the last week, there are two national organizations that are nonpartisan that advise legislators on what is working, what is the data showing, and kind of trying to give us really like balanced advice, and create a space that is bipartisan and nonpartisan to talk about public safety and youth justice. And they had 3 recommendations that I think are very in line with what we've heard is working in other countries. Their 3 recommendations were to develop a statewide adolescent prevention service strategy. And I'm really excited about what we are doing here in Minnesota on the youth, YIPA, Youth Intervention and Prevention. I always forget what the A stands for. It's a thing. Anyway, YIPA grants were created in, I think it was 1974 or 76. And in the last term, we more than doubled their funding, and these are all intervention and prevention programs. Before we more than doubled their funding, they were already funding 120 programs across the state, a lot of restorative justice programs. And I toured a juvenile probation department in Washington State last summer, and they had nothing like what we have with our YIPA grants. And then we also created an Office of Restorative Practices, which finally they're hiring a director. That's too hopefully. But yeah, it's a statewide permanent office, and we also gave them like gobs of money. Hope to give them more money, but we got $8 million this biennium and then $5 million ongoing. And that ongoing funding is really key. And so I feel like we are on a good path in terms of in Minnesota creating a statewide prevention strategy. They also recommend focusing resources that law enforcement and prosecutors in our juvenile justice system have on the small number of youth who actually pose a public safety risk. So not focusing on kids who we can redirect and support, and really, like to the extent that we are going to be punitive, focusing on kids who actually are posing a public safety risk, which is very few of the children who come into contact with the system. And then addressing staffing gaps in public agency and service provider workforce. So the data shows that we should not be, do you have a question?
Say the A's for association.
Oh, thank you. The YIPA, the Youth Intervention and Prevention Association. Thank you. But yeah, so none of the recommendations of the Council of State Governments is giving to Democrats and Republicans across the country are that we need to lock up more kids. And they provided some really good data just saying like, like there's a lot of messaging, fear-based messaging around like, oh my gosh, kids are so bad. We should be afraid. And that data that they shared with all of us, legislators across the country, really rebutted that. The last thing I just wanted to mention is I nurture my own kids, so I've got a 12 and a 14-year-old, and my 14-year-old son is super skinny, but all of a sudden over the last 6 months he got very tall. And so now he's still a kid, but he's taller than me, and it's weird, but he looks big. But when I think about like the case study for today was a 15-year-old, and I think about my 14-year-old, and I'm like, he's a baby. Like yesterday, I was like, help me do the dishes, and he's like, how do I do a thermos? I'm like, it's not hard. And so we just need to think about our own kids, if we can just have like a level of empathy. And I hope like as policymakers, I feel like I'm trying really hard to be that voice in the legislature, and I think Sarah Davis, because the way I came to the, sorry, I'm just keeping talking, I'll stop talking now. Okay.
No, thank you so much for the advice. I love that you talked about sort of things that are, coming or going right. I think for lots of us that are really interested in this work, we've studied the problem for so long, right? For so long. And so to start thinking about what is possible, what is going right, what are some things that are currently happening, I think is a good place to be in. We're gonna go there in a second. I'm really curious to sort of come back to this idea about the sort of values and objectives on the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Especially earlier when we were listening to the panel, one of the things that stuck out to me, I even jotted it down, was this idea or principle on normalization, right? And I think for young people, one of the things I see a lot is this constant contradiction, right? Whereas you're a child, stop acting like an adult, but then we adultify them, and then they come into our systems, and when they act like children, when they pass notes and they're in residential facilities, we write them up for contraband, right? When they have too much deodorant or not enough deodorant, they get written up for that in facility. So it's this constant contradiction. Who are they supposed to be? How are they supposed to behave? And so I really love this idea of creating spaces where inside should replicate like outside. And my hope is that also translates to how we think about behavior. I'm going to go over to Katie, and I'm curious about whether or not you see spaces where the rights of the convention are, being enacted, or maybe there are parallels or small examples in the US. And if not, what do you think is getting in our way?
Great question. Yes, I see spaces. I mean, the short answer is I think that there are things happening, and in fact, one of the things I think that might be getting in our way, and this is not just for youth justice work, but it's for work in the criminal legal space more broadly, is we do focus on the problem, both in our data, but also in the stories we tell, rather than showing possibility, highlighting things that are working. So I appreciate you sort of bringing up some wins or some progress, because I think that's important. I don't think we should stop there, of course, but I think one of the things that's getting in our way is, and this actually really connects to what folks are talking about, and as a researcher, there's, I think we're kind of stuck on like the data shows, the research shows, we've been studying this for a long time, and I often think about what is that data and how do we look at it, and oftentimes it is numbers, and it is numbers disconnected from real humans and real stories. And so I think one of the things that I feel like is missing and that I think stands in our way is actually getting a little bit more complex with our data, which starts to feel a little wild, but what if instead of just looking at disparities, we actually understood individual experiences? What if the data was presented to us not by other adults, but by young people in their voices? And so I think there's a lot of room for creativity, and this is where I see the things that I'm most excited about are these creative approaches where youth are actually centered, not just in the sense of like what is best for them, but let's actually hear from young people, and in places where sort of creativity is allowed. I love the international perspective because we get to think, I think Malika said this, we often don't pause and say what is happening elsewhere, what is possible. So that's one of the things that I think is really important. The other thing that in the research, there's been sort of a movement towards positive youth development, PYD, positive youth justice. Sort of we're seeing conversations, I think, that we weren't decades ago about the importance of looking at youth with an asset lens, right? Trying to understand rather than examining youth as deficits, how do we actually explore what assets young people have and how we can build on those and how we can build systems that help support those. But to the point that both folks up here next to me said, I think that we sometimes focus narrowly then on those individual systems rather than the broader context, right? Young people are living in families, not just in families, but in communities with social networks and schools and neighborhoods. And so without putting young people into context as we think about positive youth development, I think that we'll sort of get stuck on the individual rather than actually trying to understand how do we help young people, how do we support their assets by also supporting their context, right? So pretty quickly I start to say it's not just about youth and criminality and young people, but it's about our entire communities and it's about guaranteed basic income. And the reality is like we have to sort of think bigger because these structures and systems are where our young people are growing up. I can think of some examples. My deep experience working with young people is actually out in California. And so there were a few exciting things happening when I was out with the Alameda County Detention Center, really focusing on putting youth at the forefront of ideas. So there were some cool sort of back to school interventions, reentry programs that were really youth led, that were really exciting. And so I see small possibilities for change, and I think we need to think about those, highlight those, and make sure that those stories are actually connected directly to this data that we talk about. Because instead, we sort of say the numbers show, and here's an anecdote, but how do we actually think of those numbers as young people, as our kids? And how do we think about them beyond just the harm that they cause? I was actually, with the case of the day, I was thinking, I kind of want to know a little bit more about JQH. Like, what do they like to do? That might actually help us think about how they're processed. What, where are they excited? Do they have siblings? So those things matter. And so I think that might be getting in the way of real progress for us.
Thank you. I do want to pause for a second and then come back to our panel, but I'm curious if Ralph or if one of the folks online would be interested in part of this conversation around contextualizing young people, right? Like often we talk about their behaviors wildly decontextualized from their lives, right? I think Curtis talked about this idea of like survival, right? So there might be a coping behavior that's happening outside of systems that serves them really well and is really necessary, and then they come into our systems and we label it a very different thing because we don't contextualize them and we focus a lot on individual youth and not on whole family systems. And I think one of the pieces of pushback that I've received sometimes when we talk about other countries doing things differently is people will say, well, context, right? Like what is, outside of the youth legal system look like in places like Germany, right? It's different, so how could you even compare the two? And so I'm really curious, and Ralph, I'm just looking at you, but anybody else could join in. If you would speak a little bit to this idea of like, how maybe folks do or do not contextualize the lives that young people have and the complexity of that, and does that contribute to your successes, or is it unrelated?
You want me to line? Yeah, I think it's a very, very good question. The context really matters a lot. So the thing is with juvenile justice or with justice in general, juvenile justice, it always comes too late, right? It comes to the point that things have already gone wrong, or we consider or we think they have gone wrong. So in the early development, you don't get any serious numbers. But in the early days of the development of the German Juvenile Court Act, there are a couple old white men with beards thinking about how do we do this better? And this is all informed, came out from the idea that the whole criminal justice system has to be modernized. So at that time, a scholar, and at the same time a legislator with the name Franz von Liszt, cousin of the composer, he was very influential, and he wrote a piece on how to reform the criminal justice system, how to make it more rehabilitative. So we're speaking like early 20th century. And cutting what I like. And he said one thing that struck with me when I first heard it, that is, the best criminal policy is a good social policy. If we don't have a good social policy, we can do whatever we want, right? We pull kids out, they give them some form of whatever treatment, whatever facility, and then send them right back into where they come from. How do we expect change to happen? So now we're entering the whole field of how do we compare systems in the context of the system. I mentioned to Douglas yesterday when we talked that if you hit rock bottom in Germany, it's probably not as hard as rock bottom in the United States. There's we are still a social welfare system. So everybody has health insurance. Everybody. You are unemployed. If I lose my job here, and then have to go back to Germany, I would have automatic health insurance. I would get dental care, I would get hospital care, and I would be covered. So one fear is less. And then, of course, there's social services that would help me find housing. It's not all nice and shiny in Germany, so social welfare funds are reduced, people have less money. However, that's a context that's important, right? To kind of keep in mind, how do we compare this? On the other hand, though, if we look at costs of what we pay per, for instance, inmate per year in the United States and Germany, the average is for the United States, if I'm not wrong, between 40 and 50 grand per person a year, per inmate a year. That's roughly what the German system costs per inmate. So the money, it wouldn't be much more expensive to use that money to bring it to the people. So there is, of course, there's the social context, there's labels, we just have to keep in mind, like, who are the ones who talk about what we do with people. Like, it's the same group of middle class, well-educated people who are, you mentioned the body, right? You mentioned Curtis, yeah, right? You mentioned, like, who are the ones who talk about whom, right? So on that note, maybe there's one county that tops Minnesota when it comes to disproportionate arrest incarceration rate, it's Dane County in Wisconsin. It's the worst. It's the nation's leader. It's the county I live in. It's where UW is. Like, you can make wonderful experience at the terrace, and then you go 2 miles south, and you have people with different experiences. So policing is another issue, right? So we can't policing out of our county. So there's social services, there's healthcare, there's access to healing, access to education. How about policing? German cops are trained for 3 years. They learn to de-escalate. They have to take mandatory classes in psychology and mental health. In how do I see maybe someone who has a mental breakdown and distinguish that from someone who's actually, like, has violent tendencies? You know what police training looks like in the United States. And I'm not judging, but simply this is another thing that needs to be addressed.
Can I jump in? Because I think there's so many, I think in terms of money, like, if you say to people it costs this much to send somebody to prison, the problem with a lot of people is they think the narrative is, well, that person belongs in prison, right? And I think a lot about the kids that we see coming into the system, and I would like nothing more than to tell their stories, but we can't. We can't. Because of privacy, right? If we could, and I hate this word, humanize our young people, we know what their stories are, but we cannot talk about them. And I think that's the huge issue. If we could talk about everything that we see, I think people could start to see themselves and their kids in these situations and say, hey, we could intervene early on. I did want to talk about a happy thing. Just because if I said that there was a program in the system that had an 81% success rate with young people, would you know about it? Would you think?
If you texted me about it, yes.
Representative Feist just said, if I texted her about it, yes. And that's because we have one of the county attorney's office created an entirely new path for young people. It's called our Youth Auto Theft Initiative, designed by Sarah Davis. Some of our team is here. But here's what's interesting about it. It was in the script this morning, right? If law enforcement did something that had an 81% success rate with young people, where do you think it would be? On the front page of everything, right? The story about our program is buried deep in the newspaper, and the headline is Hennepin County, Hennepin something, right? And the interesting thing about this is this has never been done in Minnesota or across the country that we know of. And it's knowing that law enforcement cannot, the clearance rates for auto thefts are around 4% Hennepin County-wide. But we know, law enforcement knows that young people are involved in risky behavior. So we created this entirely different pathway so that law enforcement can tell us who these young people are. One of the frustrations and the complaints that law enforcement has is that we're not giving that information back to them. And we had a hard time getting any law enforcement. In fact, we were unable to get law enforcement to be with us at the press conference. And part of my thought process on that is, this is not traditional policing. We work with their data analysts, right? It is not the I arrest, I punish. And so that's a narrative that I think people push against. And so 81% of the young people that were offered services, their families too, did not come back to us with a case. So this is 81% of young people in our community here who, with any luck here, will never come into our youth system. Right? And I'm guessing most of you had no idea that that existed, even though we had a press conference on it Wednesday. right? And so it's such a powerful uphill climb to talk about or get it out there, I would say, these successful things, because they're not the traditional system, and there are narratives that push against it.
Thanks so much, Mary. I want to jump up and then we'll come back down. I want to be mindful of time, and we've got a handful of other questions. Gary, I see your hand up. I see your hand up, Gary.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Interesting conversation. Okay, so I'm just responding to your question. Apologies. It reminds me of nearly 20 years ago when I started this work in Northern Ireland, and there was a huge amount of resistance from the judiciary, the prosecutors, lawyers, and the entire system, really, because it was entirely untested and entirely a whole new way of thinking. And I suppose we must really be grateful to our legislators at the time, because they enshrined in law a young person's right to be at least offered the process. And so that's where we began. And of course, being offered the process is one thing, but others buying into it was an entirely different proposition. And so we had judges who found ways of circumnavigating the law, who just would completely decide to disregard the law, actually just sentence young people as they chose. But I suppose as time went on, we began to build a case in terms of recidivism. Did we reduce crime? Did we take young people out of the system? Did we reduce delay? And for us, the very beginning was the cost. So in our juvenile justice centre for young people, the cost is roughly £3,000 per week to keep one young person incarcerated. The entire youth justice process, the restorative process, is £3,000. So that's where we began, which was this is a cheaper route, and therefore it's worth validating to see if actually it does work, because in the long run it'll save the public purse. And secondly, we also enshrined in it that the victims under the Victims Charter have the legal right to face the person who's harmed them the most. And so our cases in Northern Ireland are dealt with on a case-by-case basis. So I have young people who I've worked with for 2 or 3 or 4 years who have had multiple restorative processes, some up to 25. But when the legal arguments are made as to whether or not this is appropriate for a young person, say on their 23rd youth conference, we always go back to the Charter on the Victims' Rights, because that victim in that particular case has then the right to face that young person should they so choose. And I suppose we have developed over the years a track record. And our track record would say that about 60 to 65% of all young people who commit a crime in Northern Ireland, one restorative process is enough for them to have learnt from their mistakes and actually to go off and be a productive citizen. It then rises to about 85 or 86% that takes about 3 restorative processes with 3 separate victims for that young person to change their way of life and actually not to commit crime again. And then up until about 6 or 7 youth conferences for up to 93%, and that's slightly more young people who would have a much more trauma-informed background. And then the last 6% are young people who are what we call career criminals, young people who they get up every morning and say, how can I commit a crime today? But they're still offered that process, and there is still value in them being offered that sit down with the direct victim. And we've opened ourselves up to any organisation across the world that wants to come and see what we do, who wants to evaluate what we do, who wants to take on a research project and monitor what we do. Because for us, that has been the clear path. It's been providing evidence along the way of when this works, how this works, and in what way this works. But we started with cost because it was the one thing that made everyone sit up and listen. It's cheaper, which is a very low common denominator, but that worked for us. But even today, 20 years in, there is still resistance from the judiciary, especially in high-level cases of serious crime. Part of my role is training judges, training lay panel, training prosecutors in the processes that we use to encourage them to continue to refer these cases. I think that resistance will always be there, but for me, it's about whether or not that young person has that opportunity to make amends and to change their lives. And that's the important part of this. And that's what makes it a very worthwhile process you're involved in. And I wish you all the best with it in the future.
Thanks, Gary. I heard a couple of things, and then, like I said, I promise I'm going to keep us moving because we've got a couple more questions, and there's one in particular I selfishly want us to get to. But I did hear both Gary and Ralph talk about, things like context, but Gary specifically talk about risk taking from a systems perspective, right? We can't make any decisions until we have all the data. And we can't make any decisions until we've studied everything. And what might it mean to just try something different? And so that came up for me. And the other thing that came up for me that I wanted to reflect back, because I think it's a really important point, Mary talked about this idea of narratives, that even sometimes in our current context, when you start with things like cost, the narratives about deserving youth are really, really loud, right? And so even if it costs less to not incarcerate young people with black and brown skin, the narratives are so dominant that we don't find black and brown children to be worthy, right? And so I think that that's a really, really important to underscore, that even when we highlight research and we name things like cost, those narratives are really loud. And as a small pitch this afternoon, there is a breakout about narratives of young black people, and so please stick around for that. I'm curious, it's 11:45. What do I got, 15 minutes-ish? I'm curious when you think about JH and how this young person might move through our system. What are some of the things that you might be thinking about? What are some of the questions that you might have? Especially when you think about what we sort of heard earlier this morning. Curtis, want to start?
Well, I'll reflect on that, and then I'll try to tie in just a couple of things that I've also heard that I just want to make sure that we put a point on. As I reflect, like I do when I look at all young people, right? And one of the things that stuck out to me was looking at previous interactions, within the system, right? And it's like when someone tells me that a youth has had, say, 17 contacts with the system, to me that's 17 times that the system has spent on that youth and their family, right? How is it that a youth can have contact with the system that many times and still not be in a position to be provided the services that they need that would draw them out, on that particular system? And I think for me that dovetailed into a lot of the things that I heard, but also some of the things that, I'll just be honest, that also kind of frustrate me, right, when we talk about our youth. And a lot of it has to do with not the sense of urgency that I think that we should have to tackle, these issues, right? We spend a lot of time, talking about some of our accomplishments, right? But what does that do for a youth that's still sitting in placement right now? What does that do for a young woman, right, who is a victim and survivor, who's been a runaway, right, who is now placed in a secure detention facility for nothing other than her trying to escape the situation that she was in, right? And then we talk about, again, messaging, right? And to me, the onus is on us to make sure that messaging gets out there, right? We just had 2 legislative sessions, and I would care to know how many people in here actually know the significant wins that we had at the legislature, right? And I'm not talking about the money part. I'm talking about the fact that we have now changed the fact that youth can no longer be coming to a court with shackles and restraints on. I'm talking about how we changed the way youth can be strip searched now going into facilities, right? That youth can no longer be placed in solitary confinement anymore, right? That we've actually raised the age of delinquency from 10 to 13 with no carve-outs, which is probably the most progressive in the nation, right? And so those are a number of the wins that we've had. Many of you probably had no idea about that, but again, what does that do for our youth who are still trapped within, this system, right? And what are the things that we haven't invested in? Right now, we have no central repository for data here in Minnesota, right? When I was deputy commissioner at the Minnesota Department of Corrections, I can tell you where every adult was in every one of our facilities. Right now, I cannot tell you how many youth are in any one of our facilities around the state. We have no central repository for data. But what I can tell you is what many of you probably don't know is that roughly over 75% of the youth who come into contact with the system, right, are not for our most violent offenses, right? I can tell you that more than half of the youth in Minnesota on probation right now are for misdemeanors, right, and gross misdemeanors. Those are the realities, right, of that we're facing. So when we talk about how we're going to invest, our money and how we're going to invest our time, it's important that we have an acute focus on that. You mentioned something that I think is very important that we don't focus on either. You talk about the social part of this, right? We have youth that we recognize that we have disparities in education, healthcare, the justice system, and across the board. And we have youth who are coming up within that environment. And then we have appalled and shocked when a youth makes a behavior coming out of that environment that we recognize all of the disparities that come from the social aspect of that, right? And so putting this back into context and going back to this case that we're supposed to be reflecting on, again, I think it's just incumbent upon us to not rest on the things that we feel that we've accomplished. Because again, what does that do for the young man and the young woman out there who hasn't received the benefit from said accomplishments yet, right? And to continue to have a sense of urgency. And when we think about this young man, in particular around and we're reflecting on the domestic situation with this young man. There's a lot of other variables that I think play a role into that. When we're talking about particularly around domestic, and I saw, how much time did the youth spend, right? And it goes back to my time as a PO. And I remember we were talking with the judge one day, and they were talking about implementing a curfew on this youth. And the idea was because nothing good happens, outside of 8 o'clock with that environment, right? And you have a youth who will sit there and tell you, well, nothing good happens at my home after 8 o'clock as well, right? So it gets back to this fundamental thought of not just a focus on the youth, but we're focused both on the family and the environment at which they're coming from, and making sure that we all have an onus and a sense of urgency. Because you also made the point, whether you look at many of these facilities, no disrespect, but you look at many of the legislators, and you look at many of our justice providers, they're not reflective of the youth in which who are coming into contact with the system. That does not mean that they cannot be a fierce ally and advocate for those youth. But I do think that these are things that we have to name and that we have to take into consideration when we're talking about how youth become available to both the services and resources that we are looking to provide for them.
Thank you, Curtis. Curtis. I'm curious if Katie or Representative Feist, just sort of start in the middle, have a response to that, or things that Curtis said that resonated, or good taking it back to JH.
They're not like big
I think thinking about, at the risk of repeating myself or repeating some of the things that have been said, I think when I think about this individual, and we've heard this from our international context, we have to think about these individual cases as people with different needs, different contexts, different family environments, and we have to address those needs. So one of the things that comes to mind for me, at least when I sort of heard the case presented, is how we think about the other systems that this young person is interacting with, and where those systems can or should also be supportive. And I don't just mean sort of education, which I think sometimes we think about with young people as an obvious system that should be more supportive of young people, but also like rec centers and libraries and these public spaces where young people spend their time. Like how do we put young people at the forefront of those conversations as well? I feel like it was a couple of years ago, I was in space, I feel like maybe it was even Malika, that mentioned like we often think about this criminal legal system and then it's like, also there's the juvenile justice system as this sort of separate thing, and how do we, rather than separating kids in the juvenile justice system as a separate thing, knowing that we need to treat young people differently, how do we actually address those issues alongside and with as much importance as some of these broader systemic conversations? So, again, like I sort of go back to a developmental context and really think about this young person as living in community, in family, in public spaces, and how do we actually address and provide support there for that young person. It's really what comes to mind for me.
I have some kind of big picture takeaways in terms of how we translate this to progress at the legislature. And I was thinking about the sense of urgency and how Curtis, when we talked a while ago before last session began, you said we needed to invest $50 to $75 million just on kids in our public safety budget. And I went to our chair and I was like, that's how much money I want. And it helped, and we did a pretty good job. But it helped to think really big. And I remember I was in a room with the two chairs when we were in conference committee saying how much money I wanted. And I wanted TAILS. It's called TAILS, is ongoing money. And one of the people said, that's a lot of money. And I was like, yeah, that's the point. But I think about it this year when I was like, I want more money. I know we don't have much, but I want more. And I was told, but we did stuff for kids last year. Why do we need to do it again? And I was like, it's urgent. The need is vast. The injustices are huge. We can't just be well, we did it in 2023, so I guess we fix that. And so I wasn't able to get money this year, but we did create a restorative restitution kind of pathway for kids, and tied the funding we created last year to be allowed to be used in order to support people who've been harmed, and programming that would allow kids to engage in a restorative restitution process. But there's definitely the sense from a lot of my colleagues that are like, well, we did a lot, and we're done with that, right? And we do other stuff. And then I also, a lot of what Gary was saying, I'm coming to Ireland, Gary, so you invited us, I'm coming. But a lot of the kind of framing, well, we do need to talk about the narratives. I will say I'm super, I don't know if cynical is the word, but I'm very calculated in how I convey things to colleagues across the aisle. And we were able to provide really good data on the cost savings, and that matters to Republicans. And we were able to show it in really concrete terms. Yellow Medicine County, which created their Restorative Justice Department over 20 years ago, was able to show this 10-year window where their costs associated with out-of-home placement plummeted. And we then, Democrats, brought it back to the fact that that also reflects the plummeting and the trauma created by out-of-home placement. But that cost savings matters, and also the way that, Gary talked about, the victim, the person who's been harmed, deserving the opportunity to understand what happened to them. Restorative practices can really provide that healing in a way that our traditional system cannot. And that resonated with everyone, I thought, on the public safety team across the aisle. And this year was really interesting. One of my Republican colleagues, who's a former cop, he was really inspired by the restorative restitution bill, and he told the story about how he was a cop. There were these kids, they were bad, and instead of turning them over to the system, he said, you're gonna help wash the fire trucks for the parade. And they did, and it was fun, and it was affirming, and he was like, that's so great, we need more of that. And I was like, you support restorative justice, restorative practices, let's go. And he was really excited. And then to bring it back to something I was going to say, Mary, when you were talking, I presented to a group of seniors in Minneapolis who are really politically engaged, really interested in policy, and I presented with the Minneapolis Police Department officer about restorative justice and the work that we were doing. And they were like so into it. They're like, restorative practices are amazing. And then they're like, well, we're really uncomfortable with what's going on in Hennepin County. And so it's like, they love it in theory, it sounds really great, but then when they see like one child in one incident, and they're like, well, that scares me, so I'm not comfortable being restorative if I'm scared. And so I think like coming back to like the idea that we need to tell stories, and like for like my Republican colleague, it was like those kids, like whatever they did, like he was like clean a fire truck, and then, you know, so making it real to people is important.
Thank you so much. I have a question from the audience.
Kurt, what you're saying. How do you include parents in all of this? For example, in our system, the public defender, the parents that are allowed to be in their partner and talk to 14-year-old kid. So certain parts of our system keep the parents out. How do we bring the parents in? Those parents that we know are doing the right thing for their kids in the system.
Hey, really good question. I appreciate it. Good to see you, too. And that illuminates, again, one of the flaws within our system, right? And that also was part of the impetus and one of the foundations behind us looking to raise the age of delinquency here, right? Because to your point, prior to this legislation, as young as 10 years old, right? That was the age of delinquency, right? So for all of you 10, that means if you were at the age of 10, you could both be incarcerated in one of our juvenile detention facilities, right? Where you would be strip searched when you go into that facility. We're talking about a 10-year-old, many of whom have not been seen unclothed by outside of their parents, right? Would be strip searched going into a facility. But also to that point, because also if you had a public defender, right, their interaction was with that child, right? And that meant that they didn't have to correspond with the parents at all. And I think outside of a legislative or policy fix, I think this goes to also building relationships, right? And I think it also becomes from the investment as we talk about working further upstream, right? So when we start to see youth at a younger age start to become involved with the system prior to them becoming of an age where they are now in a delinquency form, how are we both building relationships, but how are we also providing services for that youth so that, again, once they get to an age where they are having that relationship with that public defender, that there's already been relationships built, right? And there's already an investment from those parents in that youth, because even though I might not be able to have that one-on-one interaction, or a public defender goes in, and we know that the vast majority, if not all, of youth cases are handled through plea agreements, right? There still is an onus for a parent to be involved with said child during that process, right? And I think this is one of the things, just like now, that we have to illuminate more in all of our communities so that our families are aware of this particular issue within the system, so that then there is more, not only eyes and it's more illuminated, but there also is more of a thought that when my youth does come into the contact with the system, what is my onus to be significantly involved with my youth, right? And that's why I think it's disheartening when, you know, we highlight or we say that, you know, that the system is somehow going to help the family, right? When we hear families talking about the issue that they have with the youth, and we somehow suggest that in some way, shape, or form, that the system is going to help that family, right? But also in the context of what we all know, that the system is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, right? And I think it also gets back to our core values, right? Is this about retribution, or is this about restoration, right? Is this about being punitive, or is this about accountability, right? And I also think, not to let public defenders off the hook, I know Sarah was one back in the day before she switched over, but I also think that there is an onus too for our public defenders, right? Many of you are underfunded, right? You have huge caseloads that you're trying to work off, but why is it that the vast majority of these cases are handled through plea agreements? That's a question that we have to continue to illuminate and ask why. right? Is it out of convenience or is it out of necessity, right? And so, for me, I think that until we get to a point where I go back to not resting on a number of our accomplishments, but to understand that those are just minor wins along this journey to real justice, right? Because when we talk about money, I can tell you right now, this state is negligent in the resources that are provided. We talk about mental health and chemical dependency services for youth. When you talk about girls programming in this state, we are negligent within that. How can we have the vast majority of youth who come into the contact with the system are not for our significant violent offenses, and yet we have a plethora of detention facilities around the state? We talk about out-of-home placement. When I was at the Department of Corrections, we licensed, right, all of our facilities that were out of state. It was over 20 of them. All of them were youth facilities. All of them were for mental health services. Why is that? Why are we having to send our youth out of state and for that cost when we can be handling that right here within the state and keeping our youth at home?
Thank you so much, Curtis. I know there are other questions. We will come back. I wanna be mindful of time. I'm curious, I do have a little bit of maybe a challenge. We've talked a lot about sort of policy and systems work, and I'm curious, and just a couple of words, literally, a couple of words. What can individual practitioners do to increase our ability to shift our lens to be more aligned with the human rights framework and our practice to be more aligned?
Do more and talk less.
Curtis said, do more and talk less.
I'll say share stories with the legislature.
Representative Weiss said, share stories with the legislature.
Take care of yourselves. Make sure that you're aware of your own mental health, the challenge of your work. Take care of yourself so you can keep doing the work.
Katie said, take care of yourselves.
I would say learn and then talk to your circle.
Learn and talk to your circles. We are so grateful for the time that we had together. I know we had more questions in the audience, and I'm sorry we did not get to them. If you tag one of us, we'll make sure to get them, and when we debrief this afternoon, we can circle back, because that engagement is really important to us. Can we give another round to our international and global panel?